The golden menorah of the Mishkan and of the Beis Hamikdash, as we know, was made out of a single block of gold that had to be hewn into shape. Nothing could be added on, screwed in, or welded on. The question is, what constitutes the menorah? Which parts of it had to be made out of that single block of gold? For example, the neros, the actual holders of the oil, were they or were they not part of that original single-piece menorah? In a Meifan Asiyas HaNeros from the Menorahs, the Machloikas in Gemara, the Gemara records a debate about those neros, those holders of the oil at the top of the menorah. One view is that they were part of the menorah itself, Valdos was the menorah dav sein miksha, because the principle which teaches that the menorah had to be beaten out of a single piece of gold, or nit prokim mamish, and not pieces that were combined in one way or another. So according to the first version of the Gemara is Kailal Oich Dineris. The first opinion says that includes the holders of the actual oil and the lamps themselves. At Zweite Dea is, but then there's another opinion in the Gemara that says, no, as Dineris are given a bazunda zach von the menorah, that the lamps were actually independent of the menorah itself. Just before lighting the menorah, they would place the lamps into the branches of the menorah. And the Seder von Atovas Nike Haneres is given, and so therefore the process of how they cleaned out the menorah was as mesalkon from the menorah, that they would actually take the lamps off the menorah, put them in the oil, clean them out, and then put them back and refill them. Okay, so two opinions: are the lamps part of the menorah or not? In the Gemara verbindt es mit dem Plukta, the Gemara links that to another debate, which is Tzidos was steht bei der Menorah, whether when the Torah tells us that Kikar Zav Tar Yasa Oisa, that the menorah has to be made out of a single block of gold, es kol hakelim oile, as well as all of these vessels, meint oich di neiros as eich zebois min hakikar. Does that include the lamps, that they have to be out of that original block of gold? Only if he's a given mixture, which would obviously mean then that they're also beaten into shape. Or only the menorah itself was made out of a single block of gold, but not the lamps. Only if he's a given mixture, which is why the lamps were not beaten, they were actually added in afterwards. Okay, so what do we do in practice? The Rambam paskent lahalocha. The Rambam tells us that practical halacha is menorah haba zahav. If the menorah is made out of gold, says the Rambam, because there are possibilities if they couldn't afford it, they could make it out of other metals as well. But if it is made out of gold, then tiyakula kikar im neiroseha kula miksha. Then the entire thing has to be made out of a single block of gold, including the lamps. They have to be beaten out of the same part of gold, and according to the Rambam, the lamps are fixed in the menorah and they're part of that original block of gold. Okay, so we've got two opinions in the Gemara, and the Rambam goes with a view that the lamps are part of a single unit of the menorah. Now, Shengeret Filmol, we've learned numerous times, as Rashi Befirush La Torah is Mefarish Al Derech HaPshat, that whenever Rashi comments on the Torah, he gives us the explanation that is closest to the simple understanding of the pasuk. And sometimes that even means that what Rashi is teaching us does not fit with the practical halacha. And that's exactly what we're going to see in how Rashi explains the structure of the menorah and the design of the menorah, where we'll see that his view does not fit with the Rambam's halachic view. Okay, so wie gesagt, we already mentioned based on the Gemara in Menachos, verbindet die Gemara die Plukta zi neres darf sein Miksha mit der Menorah, mit der Plukta zi sie seinen Bois min hakikar. So the Gemara already associated whether the lamps of the menorah had to be beaten out of the same piece of gold with the fact that they are that they either are or are not part of the instruction that it has to be a single piece of gold. Und wenn der Ramban sagt, look how the Ramban puts it, he tells us, Adas kulam lo yavoy b'mishkal hakikar ela guf ha'menorah b'mashu ima miksha. The Ramban says very clearly, everybody will agree that what has to come out of that single block of gold is whatever the Torah describes has to be beaten into the shape of the menorah. Und der Phariser Masber, that's how he explains, as like the day and Bryce the Melech Mishkan, as the Melkachaim Machtais Bois Min Hakikar. So the Ramban tells us something fascinating. We have two tools that are associated with the menorah called Melkachaim and Machtais. So if you have a look in the Bryce tells us that they are also part of that original block of gold. Therefore, the Ramban has a unique interpretation of what these tools are. The Melkachaim and Machtos are not independent tools that are used for the menorah, but they're actually part of the menorah. And therefore, Naratel from the menorah, they're part of the menorah. What are they? So he says, Melkachayim are little lids that go on top of the lamps to make sure the oil doesn't get contaminated by something falling into it. And the machtos, he says, are little cup, almost like surfaces underneath each lamp to collect any of the sparks that fall. So the Ramban is of the view that Melkachayim and machtos are translated as parts of the menorah, and they had to be beaten out of the same piece of gold. Rashi Abazach. Now let's get to Rashi, who's the one we're going to focus on. When Rashi comments on the Torah telling us that it has to be made out of a single block of pure gold, he says that when you take the menorah with all of its components and put it together, the total size or weight of it should equal a kikar of gold. And prior to that, but he explains Melkachayah not like the Ramban, that they're the lids on top of the lamps. Rather, says the little tongs that you use to remove the wicks. And he says Machteseh are like little spoons, almost like little shovels, miniature shovels. So now Rashi is showing us something which we haven't yet seen in the Gemara or in the opinion of the Ramban, and that is that there's a possibility that there are tools used for the menorah that are not part of the menorah, yet they come out of that original golden block, because there's a certain quantum of gold that is dedicated to the menorah, and the Melkachayah, which according to Rashi are separate tools, have to come out of that same quantum of gold. So let's try and understand why Rashi says that, because the Pirush HaPashut, first of all, Rashi, of course, as we know, is going to take the simplest explanation. So the simplest explanation for an Aleph, Melkachayim or Machta, those two tools, B'chol Mokim in Tanakh, anywhere else that those words are used in Tanakh, is Akele Nifrit from the Zach by welchem Menutzdes. They're always tools that are independent of where they are operating. So you never think of a spade or a spoon as being part of an object. You think of it as something you use with an object. And the same with tongues. In fact, we find machtos for sure in the context of the Mizbeach, and we know that those are spades, shovels that are used independently of the Mizbeach itself. They're not made out of stone like the Mizbeach is. So that's the first thing that Rashi notes. Secondly, he tells us, Beis, kikar zav tor yasei sos kol hakelim ha'eleh. The simplest understanding of the pasuk that says a kikar, which is a quantity of gold, you should make all of the vessels, is as oisa di menorah. The simplest explanation is that the Torah is telling us the menorah itself, on kol hakelim ha'eleh, and all the tools associated with the menorah, ala kelim vasveren demontim pasuk, all of those which are listed in the pasuk, dafen gemach veren from them kikar zav tahor, they all have to be made out of that single block of gold. That doesn't mean they all have to be hewn out of the single block of gold. So Rashi is telling us something quite different to the Gemara, where the Gemara said either everything's from the block and then it's all one piece, or it's not all from the block and then it's independent pieces. Rashi is saying it could all come from the block of gold and also include independent pieces. With that in mind, so therefore Rashi is showing us that the concept of what has to be formed out of a single piece of gold is not naturally linked to how much gold is involved in the menorah. Therefore, Rashi's approach to saying the menorah has to come from this kikar of gold is the menorah has no bearing on if it has to be beaten out of a single piece of gold, because it's possible, according to Rashi, it could come from that original collection that was melted down into this kikar of gold, and yet it could still be an independent tool. Now, at first glance, it would appear as Rashi held us that Tzivim Miksha by Menorah is Kel Eich Dineros. Now let's get to the crux of what we're going to discuss in the Sikha, and that is the lamps. So Rashi has clearly said the menorah has to be formed out of a single piece of gold, and the tools used for the menorah, like the little spoons and the tongs, they are from the same original kikar zav, but they're not beaten out of the same piece. They are separate. Now, what about the lamps? L'chora, you would assume that Rashi's view is that the lamps are part of the menorah itself. Because when it says that you beat the menorah into shape, is Rashi meforish lo yasen chulios. Rashi says you shouldn't make it in segments. V'lo yaseh koneha v'neireseh evorim v'chakach yad became. And you shouldn't make the branches and the lamps as separate pieces of the menorah, which are subsequently fixed on, screwed in or welded on or whatever. Rather, it all comes out of a single piece. And the design is that you beat it in such a way that you forge the branches to go off in independent directions, but they come from a single piece of gold. So the fact that Rashi says you can't make the branches and the part that's relevant for our conversation right now, the lamps, you cannot make them as separate limbs, so to speak, which you then affix to the menorah. The menorah would sound like what Rashi is telling us is that the lamps of the menorah have to be beaten out of that original piece of gold together with the menorah. That's what we would think that Rashi is saying, and that would be, of course, aligned with the Rambam's view that if it's made out of gold, the neros, the lamps, have to be beaten out of a single piece of gold. They cannot be separate. That's what you'd think. Ober, Kadaika Shapir, but when you really pay attention to what Rashi is telling us in context, it's not so clear that Rashi is telling us the lamps have to be part of the single piece of gold that makes the menorah. Because Rashi Zaknor, all Rashi told us was, as Mikshate Oseh HaMenorah, that the fact that you beat the menorah into its unique shape is Shelel as the menorah soll nit sein an Anofen von Evorim v'chakach yad became. All Rashi said that excludes is separate pieces which are afterwards screwed together or welded together or affixed together to make a final product. Das heißt, die Menorah darf nicht sein zu aufgeklebt von besonderen Teilen. What Rashi is highlighting over there is that the finished product of the menorah cannot be a whole lot of pieces that are put together. Und in dem sagt Rashi, as Punkt wie die Knei am Menorah haben nicht getot seine Vorim v'chakach yad became. And Rashi says in that context, just like the branches of the menorah obviously cannot be separate pieces that are then connected to the central stem of the menorah. So likewise, Rashi is telling us the lamps don't get attached to the menorah. Because if the lamps are attached to the menorah, stuck to the menorah, then the menorah is made out of pieces. Aber wegen dem die Neres können sein und bleiben besondere Chalokim von der menorah. But the question of whether the lamps are in fact independent pieces that are not part of the menorah, that's a different question. They're just things that you place on top of the branches when you need to light them. Rashi is not talking about that. In dem Oifen is doch the menorah mixtures is mechaticha achas is going to the menorah. It's quite possible that you could have a menorah that is absolutely and completely whole, and then you have lamps that are added to the whole menorah. Rashi doesn't tell us either way. That's why when you look at the end of Rashi's commentary, he no longer speaks about the lamps. When he's speaking about the single menorah, he only speaks about the branch, because the branches are part of the single menorah, and it is possible that the lamps are actually independent, and they're put on top. They're not attached to, they're put on top of the branches, and then you could have a menorah that's made out of a single block and still have independent neros. Okay, so we don't know how exactly does Rashi see the neros. Because it's not absolutely clear in Rashi which way he holds, that the lamps are part of the original menorah block that's shaped, or that they are appendages that are added on later, but not attached. And Rashi doesn't tell us that he's unsure of what it is, which Rashi is not afraid to do. If there's lack of clarity in the pasuk, he'll tell us, I don't know how you're supposed to interpret it. So if Rashi doesn't tell us clearly, and he doesn't say that he's unsure, well, then we have to say, as in Limud Apshat, it must be that if you're learning the psukim at the simplest level, it must be so obvious where the neros fit into the picture, in Rashi doesn't even have to get into the details and tell us, because we should be able to work it out just from reading the psukim. So let's work out what do the psukim tell us about the status of these neros lamps. Are they part of the menorah, or are they added onto the menorah when needed? So the Seder and the Parsha from Leches HaMenorah is, let's look at the order of how we're told the instructions to make the menorah, and that will help us understand where the neros fit in. This is how it goes. The first thing the Torah tells us, you should make a golden menorah. Miksha goimer, it has to be beaten into shape, and that includes yerecha, v'kono, gvi'eha, kaftereo, ufrocheo, mimeno yiyu. Okay, the various components of the actual menorah itself, the stem and the designs, etc., are all from that block of gold. Denach is the pasuk mefarif v'machti knei menorah gevei v'chulei. Then the Torah tells us how they should look and how they should be made on his Messiah, and then he concludes kaf terema k'noisem mimeno yiyu, that all these buttons and flowers or whatever have to be out of that single piece of gold. Kula miksha achas zohav tor, all a single piece of gold that has been shaped into the menorah's unique shape. Und dennoch steht, after having told us all of the details of what the design of the menorah includes, and reiterating twice that it's made out of a single piece of gold, after that it says, you're supposed to make the 7 lamps that go at the top, and the various tools, the tongues and the spoons, and all of that comes out of a single amount of gold, a kikar of gold. The same thing happens in Parshas Vayakal, where the Torah recaps how everything was actually done. There too the Torah presents them in this particular order. Now, look at the order. The fact that the instruction to make the lamps of the menorah is specifically listed after we're told all of the very intricate details of how you make and design the menorah, and after telling us that the whole thing has to be beaten out of a single piece of gold, that implies that the simplest understanding of the psukim, which is Rashi's approach, clearly the lamps are separate. They don't belong to the actual menorah itself. That's why they're listed and discussed after all of the intricate details of the menorah and the instruction to make it out of a single block of gold. So, so they must fit into a similar category to the tongues and to the spoons, which are the next thing on the list, separate from the menorah itself. So that would be the pshat, and therefore Rashi doesn't have to tell us that the menorahs are not part of the menorah, because it's pretty obvious from the psukim. And we can corroborate that with a second proof. In Parashas Pekudei, the final parasha of the book of Shmos, where the Torah describes how they presented all the components of the Mishkan in front of Moshe, state, there the pasuk says, Es ha-menorah ha-tahora, that they presented the pure menorah, Es ne'yoseh ha-goymer, and its lamps. So if logically we agree that the lamps are not part of the actual menorah itself, but rather they're appendages that are put on top, well, then we understand why the Torah separates them. They brought the menorah to Moshe, and then they brought the lamps to Moshe. That would make sense. Whereas if you had wanted to argue that the lamps are part of that actual original structure, the singular structure of the menorah, it wouldn't make any logical sense to say they brought Moshe the menorah and they brought the lamps. You're not going to say they brought the menorah and its flowers and its stem. Bringing the menorah because if the lamps were part of the menorah, as soon as you brought the menorah, you brought the lamps as well. Exactly as we wouldn't say that you brought the menorah with all of its designs. So it would seem very clear that the pshat of the pasuk is that the menorahs, the lamps of the menorah, are not part of the actual body of the menorah. They are technically separate. Rashi therefore doesn't have to tell us about it because it's self-evident. That would then show us that Rashi's view is that the lamps of the menorah are not included in the parts of the menorah that have to be beaten out of a single piece of gold. That with that information in mind, we can clarify certain things about what Rashi says here that don't seem to be absolutely clear, and comparing to what Rashi says in Vayakal, which also doesn't seem to be absolutely clear. Which, as noted, the parasha of Vayakal is where the Torah reviews all of the details of constructing the Mishkan. So in the pasuk there in Vayakal, where it says it says that they made the menorah and its vessels and its lamps. Shtolzach Rashi of Neiroi Seho. So Rashi quotes the word Neiroi Seho, and his Mepharish explains that Lutzinish Belaz. In Old French, it's called Lutzinish or Seluzeo or something like that. My French is not very good. And he explains, Bezichim Shashemen v'absilis nesunim b'hem, they're like little spoons that you put the oil and the wicks into. So it's the actual lamps themselves. So it's nicht verstandig. Doesn't seem to make sense. Number one, Aleph, oif die Vertes Nereseh in unser Parsha. In our Parsha, when it uses the term lamps, which is the first time we use the word lamps, usually Rashi will explain something that needs to be explained the first time that it appears. Taich Rashi says, they're like little spoons, little concave containers that you use to put in the oil and the wicks. Safe Rashi's already explained what Neiros are in our Parsha. Why does he have to re-explain it again in Parshas Vayakal? We know what it is, not hard. We know what a lamp looks like, what an oil container looks like. Beis, die to me is noch größer. The truth is, it's an even stronger question when you consider Rashi allein sagt in Parshas Vayakel. Rashi says near the beginning of Parshas Vayakel, which is mit etliche psukim früher, a few psukim before he talks about the Menorah. I don't have to re-explain everything about the Mishkan because I already explained it when it was all instructed, i.e. in our Parsha. High timer, for which reason is that Rashi nit mafarish di ruba von din yonim de nit v'sum leches hamishkan. That's why Parashas Vayakel, when you get to that part of Chitas, there's barely any Rashi because he barely comments on anything because he's already explained it before. Seiden im Fall, wenn dort kommt zu achidish, was man kann nicht wissen von mekem tzavasam, unless there's something unique in Parashas Vayakel that gives us insight about the Mishkan that we would not have known from Parashas Terumah or Tetzaveh. Because he relies on the fact that he's explained it before. So if that's the case, if in our parasha Rashi has already explained what Neiros are, little concave containers for oil and wicks, why explain it again? And the final question, that is Gimel, why does Rashi begin his explanation by giving us the French equivalent of what Neiros are? Because if we need the French, why there? Doesn't seem to make sense. If to use the word bazichen, which is spoons, is not enough to explain to us what Neiros are, and you need the French in order to clarify, then Rashi should have used the French as part of his explanation and definition the very first time he spoke about lamps, which is in our parsha, but he doesn't. So that would seem to imply that you don't need the French, because he didn't mention it in our parasha. So if you don't need the French, because it's good enough just to tell us that they're little concave containers, then why use the French in Parashas Vayakel? To understand all of that, we're going to pay attention to one other nuance in Rashi's explanation, or just by way of introduction before we get to that. The Rebbe has told us so many times that every word, even letter in Rashi is absolutely precise. You'll notice something Rashi does over here that doesn't seem to be right. Not only is Rashi so precise in the words he uses in his commentary, but even the words that he chooses to use as the heading of his Rashi are also very carefully chosen. One place where you really see it stand out, how careful Rashi is, how specific Rashi is in the words that he chooses, how precise the heading he uses is in the Meibnem to Pirush Rashi, is in the one we're looking at now. Because in Pasuk Anal, the Pasuk said, Ves Menorah Samor, that they brought in front of Moshe Rabbeinu the Menorah that gives light, Ve'es Keleha, and its vessels, Ve'es Neiroseha, and its lamps, Ve'shem Amor, and the oil that was used. Shab Rashi Drai Bazunder Dibra Maschil. So to comment on this pasuk, Rashi used three different divrei hamaschil, three different headlines, and he explains three different components of the pasuk. Look what he does. Aleph, ve'es keleha, he quotes those two words. He says, what's ve'es keleha? Melka chaim machtos, the spoons and the tongues. Beis neiroseha, then he says lamps, lutzainesh v'chule kenal, where he says that in Old French it's whatever, these lamps and their concave containers. Gimel v'eis shemen amor, and the illuminating oil. Afutzar chachmei lev cholein explains that it also needed special artisans, people who really knew what they were doing to produce. You look at the three divrei hamaschil, and you see a very clear distinction between them. In the ersten and letzten divrei hamaschil, in the one quoting kelim and the one quoting the oil, is Ashematik from Pasuk Eich and Vort v'es. Rashi quotes the full phrase that's used in the Pasuk, including the word v'es. Whereas in the second divrei hamaschil, the one that's relevant to us, the one where he talks about the lamps, is a matik nodem vort neireseho nitem vort v'es. There Rashi only quotes the word neireseho, the lamps, and he leaves out the word v'es, and you have to wonder why Rashi is so precise. So now that we know that Rashi argues that the lamps of the menorah were not beaten out of a single piece of gold along with the rest of the menorah, rather they were appendages added as and when needed, that will help us to explain it. Because Rashi's opinion is that the lamps are not part and parcel of the menorah, darf man sagen, as wenn der Pasuk sagt, Kikar Yasa Isa, es kol ha-kelim ha'ele, then we'll have to say that when the Pasuk tells us that Kikar, the quantum of gold that is used, includes all of these kelim, seine dineres nichlal nit in Isa di menorah, nor in kol ha-kelim ha'ele. Then you'd have to say that it's Kikar Yasa Isa, the menorah itself is made out of the Kikar, and the kelim are made out of the kikar. The lamps belong in the category called kelim. The nera zanim from the klei ha-menorah. The lamps are not part of the menorah, they're part of the vessels of the menorah, or working with the menorah. Now you come to Parshas Vayakel, knowing that Rashi's view is that the lamps belong to the accessories of the menorah, not to the menorah itself. Now you come to Vayakel and you seem to have a problem, because with the pasuk sagt ve'es menorah samar ve'es kela ve'es neiroseho. It distinguishes the lamps from the kelim. You should have a question. So if it already uses the word kelim, and Rashi's view is that the lamps belong to the kelim of the menorah, so you already said ves kelim, why do you have to say and also ves neireseho? So Rashi's got to answer that, and the way he does it is so Rashi has to explain. Keileha in this pasuk refers to melkochaim or machtos. Those are the tongues and the little scoops that are used in the menorah. On gleich dennoch is a matik from pasuk neiroseho, and then the next thing Rashi does is, after telling us what the kelim are, he then quotes the word neiroseho. Und ist dabei mashvit dem Wort v'es neiroseho. He leaves out the word v'es. Why does he do that? Mit der Kavona zum Madgish sein damit, because Rashi wants to highlight for us, as man darf lernen pasukile wie es wohl because Rashi says in order to understand this pasuk correctly, you have to learn it as if the word ve'es was not there in the pasuk. Why not? Because actually the lamps are incorporated in ve'es keleho, right? If it's ve'es keleho, ve'es neiroseho, it sounds like the neiros, the lamps, are separate from the kelim. So Rashi pretends that the word ve'es isn't there to show us that actually neiros are a subsection of the kelim. They'll say the period from pasuk is ves keleho. In other words, the pasuk saying you had the menorah, and then you had the kelim, which include melkochaim or machtos under the word kelim, and neiros under the word neiros. Now you're going to ask, why do that? Why, in effect, would the Torah distinguish the lamps from the other kelim if, after all, the lamps are considered kelim? Rashi answers that by giving us the French. Why is the French relevant? Was der Schöres von dem Wort Belas meint Lichtigkeit, because that word Lutzinisch, or whatever the correct French pronunciation is a word that actually means light. Luzei, or something to that effect. Und der Tanfa was die Neres werden angegriffen als Shem ha'oir. So why would the lamps not only be containers for oil that gives light, but they would be given a name that represents light? So Rashi explains the reason that they deserve that in the word Ner. Ner means source of light, is because they are the containers that you put the oil and the wicks in. Das heißt, weil in sie drückt sich aus dem Mechuven und Tachlis von dem Etzem HaMenorah. These Neros actually express the purpose of the Menorah, which is to illuminate. Without these lamps, the Menorah is just an artifact. Zu schaffen Lichtigkeit. The goal of the Menorah is to generate light. Was wir geschaffen von das, was is in die Neres Hashem Absilis und Sunim Bohem. How do you generate light? Well, you've got to have these containers that you put the oil into, and then you put the wicks into, and then you light. Aber bald das die Neres sind der Ika von der ganzen Menorah. And therefore, this is Rashi's point. Because the lamps are, yes, appendages to the Menorah, but they are integral to the Menorah, fulfilling its purpose. It's verstandig, was der Pasuk tellt sich, besonders von der anderen Klei Menorah. That's why they deserve their own mention. They can't just be generically incorporated in the term Kalim, because Kalim doesn't tell us what the purpose is. By highlighting Neros, yes, they're not part of the Menorah. Yes, they are part of the Kalim, but they have to get their own attention because they bring the Menorah to its fruition.